We're going to continue with our discussion. We're going to pick back up where we were talking about counselor credibility. And another point I want to make about counselor credibility is that the consumer may believe that the counselor is not really working in a sincere manner when the client, for example, misses an appointment. And again, this goes back to some of the time orientation, and not just time, being on time, but timeliness of informing the counselor that something is going to happen or something is not going to happen, that I won't be there for the appointment. And if the client misses the appointment, what's going to be very important is, and again, this may relate to the fact that if we look at caseload size, and you know, some of us carry smaller caseloads of 50 and 60 people. Some of us carry very large caseloads of 150 to 250. And when a client misses an appointment, it's just that, okay, was not here, did not show, yeah, and you move on. But it's important to investigate why the person missed that appointment. And I know home visits are not something that we do it now in rehab. And again, we don't have the time to work that into the schedule. But it's important to find out why the consumer missed that appointment, why that consumer missed 2 or 3 appointments. And typically when the consumer presents us with a pattern of missing appointments, the interpretation is that the consumer is not interested, or that the consumer is being uncooperative. And when we look at this from dealing with African American consumers, a lot of times when they miss an appointment, it's again sort of a defense mechanism, or it is what I call a retreat. And the retreat comes about simply because, one, they may not have yet made the commitment to follow through. 2, the trust factor within toward the service provider or even toward the service delivery system is not there. And again, thirdly, it could be this is a way to test, to see the commitment on the part of the service provider. Because again, this is that two-way expectation. You expect the consumer to do certain things, but that consumer also expects you to do certain things. So what you would see is a consumer may retreat, and that retreat may be simply not showing up for appointments. And if you don't follow up to figure out what's going on, you simply interpret this as a client being uncooperative or unmotivated, again, it calls into question, from the client's perspective, it calls into question the counselor's credibility and commitment to working with them. So it's important to at least follow up to try and determine why this appointment was missed, or why you're beginning to see this pattern of appointments being missed. Another area when we talk about cultural mistrust that has substantial impact in working with consumers in general, particularly working with African American consumers, is in the area of counselor self-disclosure. We talk about establishing rapport, we talk about establishing trust in the relationship with the consumer, and when we look at counseling strategies, one way to do this is through self-disclosure. We tell you something about us that relates to you and your situation, and the thing about self-disclosure is, first of all, it must be relevant to the consumer's perspectives and the consumer's situation. And if a counselor is going to engage in self-disclosure, it is very important that when you do this, not only is it relevant, but you do not take the focus off the consumer. Oftentimes what will happen is, because we're searching for a way to connect with the consumer or to establish that rapport, and the consumer talks about something that happened to them, and we've had a similar situation or a circumstance happen to us, then we start talking about what happened to us in that situation or circumstance, and it pulls focus or attention away from the consumer. And when that happens, again, the consumer is going to question credibility or commitment of the counselor in working with them and helping them to deal with their issues. So when it becomes a focus on the counselor that is all about me, then the credibility is going to really be questioned by the consumer. The last thing I want to mention in relation to cultural mistrust is around, and I mentioned this earlier, I called it historical hostilities. And historical hostilities come about in a relationship because people have had experiences, be those collective experiences or individual experiences that influence and shape who they are. And it's very important from the service provider's perspective to recognize these historical hostilities when you're working with African American consumers. And these historical hostilities come about simply because we can look at, when we look throughout history at the discrimination within the U.S. toward African Americans, and we look at issues around racism, we even look at the issue of patterns related to migration to the U.S. All of those are historical hostilities. The consumer did nothing to establish them. The counselor did nothing to establish them. They existed, and they're a part of that person's culture and a part of that person's identity, so they do weigh in on how that consumer is going to respond. And you need to be prepared and have some understanding of, one, what are those historical hostilities, and in what context that consumer may bring them into this rehab process or into this counseling relationship. So the acknowledgement that historical hostilities exist is important. Having some understanding of what they are and their influence is equally as important. So the thing to remember, too, is that we don't, as service providers, we don't have access to, or we don't have knowledge of consumers' experiences. And the only way we get those is when consumers share them with us. And the only way they're going to share them with us is once we have the rapport and the trust factor established. So historical hostilities can block the establishment of rapport and the establishment of trust. And they can block it even more so if we are tested and we fail the test. So that's very important to recognize those historical hostilities. So what are some of the counseling implications when we look at historical hostilities, when we look at cultural mistrust, when we look at the world view, and then we look at some of the characteristics of African Americans? How do all these things come together and present implications for the counseling process? Well, I think one thing that we need to do, and this doesn't have to be a formal process, it can be done very informally, is that it's very important to do a cultural assessment. And a cultural assessment is gaining some type of understanding of the consumer's belief system, the consumer's values, consumers' attitudes, definition of what disability is, their beliefs about healing and cure, their lifestyle, and their communication style. So we need to have just a general understanding of how all these components can come together in a cultural assessment, because this will give us some understanding of just communication, how we can communicate with the consumer. And when we fail to do a cultural assessment, especially related to the individual's cultural worldviews, this could just stammer and stagger the therapeutic process in counseling. Something else we need to consider when we talk about working with African American consumers is we need to go back to those organizations or that network and find out which individuals, which members are important. And what we do know, because of the strong religious beliefs and emphasis within the African American community, the clergy is a part of the community that plays a very big role in influencing decision-making among African Americans, the same way that elders do. So sometimes when we're trying to move clients forward in this process and we're seeing not much progress being made, and before we say unmotivated or uncooperative, we may want to elicit assistance from some of those other community or network participants. And I would always say clergy is always a safe bet and elders are always a safe bet. But the thing is, we know we have to deal with issues of confidentiality. And you know, that's something that we can't violate. And it's important, if consumers bring others into the network, that's an opening for you to use those individuals once that consumer brings them into this whole process. Now, trying to initiate from your side of getting these individuals, that is going to be something, of course, you have to get clearance from the consumer to do. But African American consumers will be less resistant to using their elders and clergy as part of their network and having you contact those individuals. And I think you would have less difficulty getting approval or agreement to say, yeah, well, you can talk to such and such a person, or you can use this person. But if you have to use somebody, those are the two, I would say, elders and clergy would be two areas you really want to give serious consideration to. We also talked about the formality that African Americans tend to engage in when they're relating to people. So again, it's very important to use caution to stay away from that first name. You don't use the first name unless you're given permission to use the first name. And again, this is not age specific. Elders almost automatically expect the titles to be used. You may find those who are younger may challenge. This is another way for them to challenge you in terms of using the formality. And if you introduce yourself as Ms. Shepherd, and then they come in and introduce themselves using a formal title, then, and if at some point you shift to use first name and they don't shift to use first name, then it's going to be interpreted as being disrespectful, but it's also going to be interpreted as them correcting you, say, well, no, it's Miss this or Mr. that. So it's very important to use first names only when given permission to do so. And typically it just takes a while for that rapport to get established for you to be granted permission to use first name. But don't expect, if it doesn't happen, this does not mean that rapport is not taking place. It is just a part of the formal way in which communication takes place. Another important issue when we're talking about counseling implication is that an African American consumer may present something to you and put it totally within a racial context. And the thing not to do is not to respond by saying, no, I think you're a little too touchy about race. Okay? Or I don't think that was a discriminatory act at all. Because again, people come to us with histories and experiences. And we just don't have the knowledge, we don't have the familiarity with what those histories and experiences are. And if that person comes in and they present it to you in that context, we're taught as a counseling strategy, when we work with clients or consumers, where do we start? We start where the consumer is. So if that's what they're presenting, it has to be addressed. If it's ignored, if it's dismissed, if it's trivialized, it's going to impact how I relate to you, how I interpret you. So it's going to be very important that you address those issues and not dismiss them. Okay? And again, it's going to take some, I think with experience and with time, because not everyone may be a legitimate accusation. But you're going to have to be able to figure out which ones are and which ones are not. And in order to do that, that means you're going to have to address it. So that's very important. Another implication when we're talking about working with African Americans for counseling is we have to have some type of recognition of the differences in their health or their counseling belief practices. Typically, there are three broad areas of different types of practices people engage in, whether we're talking counseling, whether we're talking health in terms of medicine. But people tend to engage in three different types. The first one is called efficacious practices. That means it may seem a little strange to you. It may seem a little out of the ordinary. You really don't see the real value to this, but it's not harmful, and it still has some medical or some therapeutic relevance for the individual. Okay, an example of this would be, and this is a common practice within the African American communities, particularly among the elders, is drinking lemon juice to help lower your blood pressure. Okay, it's an efficacious practice. It's not going to cause any harm to them, and the individual sees some personal value in engaging in that practice. Okay, so it's efficacious for them to engage in that practice. So you need some understanding of what these practices involve. The second type of practice is called neutral practices, and they may not have much medical or therapeutic intervention, but they tend to have great psychological benefit to the individual. For example, and we see this all the time, and it's amazing when we see some of these practices, or even what we can call superstitions, just in everyday life. An individual may be engaging in something for the first time, or they're making a commitment now to go to the next step within this process, and they may quote something. They may do a verse of some kind, or they may have a particular saying that they would like to use. And the reason they're doing this is because their interpretation or their perception is that this is clearing the way for receptiveness to take place. Okay. We see it, for example, on a day-to-day basis when in sports. Okay. When we look at team sports, and before the team takes the field or the team takes the court, what do we see them do? They huddle. Okay. And within that huddle, they've got some little ceremony going on. Okay. We don't know if that's going to help them win the game, and probably won't help them win the game. But they believe psychologically it's getting them pumped up for the game. So that's why they engage in it. So it's a neutral practice. Saying certain things within the huddle is not going to make you get a touchdown, but it's getting them psychologically prepared. So that's what a neutral practice does. It doesn't cause any harm, but it has great psychological benefit to the individual. And the last practice is called dysfunctional practices. And clearly, as it indicates, these are practices that are clearly harmful. They have no real benefit to the individual on a physical, emotional, or psychological level. And an example of this could be an individual who's diabetic and eats certain types of food, and these foods are quite harmful to them. And so getting them to stop eating these wrong types of foods. So they're engaging in a dysfunctional behavior. You have a condition, certain things you cannot do, but you don't care, you do it anyway. So having an understanding of efficacious, neutral, and dysfunctional practices among a cultural group is very important. Are you going to know all of them? No. Okay, but it's important to know that, okay, when John comes in, I know John has high blood pressure. I need to talk to him about taking his medicine and what else he's doing. And you find out that John's not taking his medicine. He's drinking lemon juice, which does help some, but it's not enough. He needs to be taking his medication, Or John is now from a neutral side. He's taking his medication, but he's also reading Bible verses. That's not causing him any harm. It's helping him psychologically, so that's a good practice. Or the dysfunctional one, John is not taking his medication. He's eating all these high-fat foods. He's not exercising. And he's got this external locus of control, that no matter what I do, I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well enjoy life. So getting an understanding of the practices along those different levels is very important. It's also important to know how African Americans define disability. Different cultures define disability in different ways. Okay? There are certain disabilities that African Americans may not consider to be a disability. Mental illness, for example. Mental illness may not even be defined as, quote, a disability. What it may be defined as is, he has a condition. He's always had it. He always will. And, there's not much you can do for him. Even though counseling and maybe medication would be the intervention, but mental illness or certain type of mental illness may not be perceived as a disability. Mr. Jones has always been that way. Everybody in the neighborhood knows he's that way. And the adjustment is that people within the neighborhood have adjusted to him and know how to deal with him. So because they've made that adjustment, they've accommodated his behavior, so it's not a disability. So again, getting an understanding of how people define disability is very important. Another area that we have to consider when we're talking about counseling is, and we do this all the time, we love to get consumers to make comparisons. We give them, we even work through scenarios with them where they're in different situations, and we try to get them to problem solve these situations. But when we're talking about making comparisons, what we want to do is avoid comparing one group to another. Okay. For example, when you go to the literature, and you will find different groups are identified as oppressed and marginalized, be it African Americans, be it Latino, be it women, be it people with disabilities, are identified as marginalized, discriminated against, and oppressed groups. We don't want to get into the habit of comparing oppressions. Okay, we're not jockeying for the most oppressed, because each group you talk to perceive they are indeed the most oppressed. So we don't want to start making those comparisons of who is the most oppressed group. What we really want to do is to look at the defining characteristics unique to that population, in this case to African Americans, and how those characteristics are influenced and impacted upon by other sociocultural factors. So we don't want to start talking about, and parents tend to do this more than anybody. We compare siblings to each other. Why can't you be like your sister? Why can't you be like your brother? Within the counseling process, it does not offer much value. And what will happen if we get into this whole system of comparing groups, clients will shut down on you. They're not going to be all that cooperative from that point, because the interpretation is, okay, you're really not understanding who I am and where I'm coming from, and you think I'm just like other people, or I'm like everybody else. So the thing to remember is that there may be similarities across all these groups, but similarity does not equal sameness. And people are very particular about those characteristics unique to them, and then to have those characteristics generalized and just say they're the same for everybody. So use caution to avoid making comparison. The last thing I want to mention in terms of an implication for counseling is understanding the consumer's priority of concern. And what I mean by priority of concern, African Americans are more concerned with meeting immediate basic needs, food, shelter. And within this rehab process, we're talking about a continuum that will get them to the point of employment. Okay? Will employment give you the opportunity for food and shelter? Yes. But the immediate problem today is not so much that I'm unemployed. The immediate problem today is that I have no place to live and I have no food. So African Americans tend to prioritize those basic needs. And until those basic needs are met, the focus is not going to be on going through the counseling process. It's not even going to be on employment in terms of a process. It's going to be on employment in terms of, I need a job today. We're talking about giving someone an assessment or an evaluation. Then we're talking about writing a plan. And then from that plan, that may say the person needs some additional training. And then after they complete that training, we're talking about a job search and then employment. That's a long-term process. But the individual is looking at, what are my immediate needs that I have to get taken care of now? And the only way employment is an immediate need is if I can get a job today or tomorrow, not a year down the road. So that, again, may be when you find someone got referred to you and they came in. And again, keep in mind, when clients come to us for services, they really don't know what it is we do. They don't know what we offer. But they're coming in with an expectation. And we say, we're referring you to vocational rehabilitation, and they're going to help you with employment. So the consumer may well be coming in with the perception that, all I have to do is go down there and get a job. But when they come in, you lay out this whole process for them, and the question is, what does this have to do with me getting a job? So again, it's how people prioritize based on their immediate needs. And that's something we definitely have to remember. I'm going to wrap up here and conclude by just highlighting a few of what I consider the key points that we've gone over in working with African American consumers. The first thing we definitely have to remember is that African Americans are not a homogeneous group. We tend to group people who look alike into one group. It's a very diverse group based on ethnicity. Someone who is African American does not have the same ethnicity as someone who is Caribbean. We also tend to group people together on SES. We tend to group people together based on geographics or location. And we tend not to look at accomplishments people have in those individual kids. So individual variation within a culture is something that we will also have to look at. Secondly, it is important that we also look at, when we talk about diversity and we talk about African Americans, we have to say what is the rate of acculturation and the rate of assimilation that has occurred. And when we talk about acculturation and assimilation, we also have to look at it based on intergenerational differences as well. Because when we look at our own families, even, we can see, I may respond to things very differently than my parents, who responded to things very differently than their parents. So intergenerational differences is something we have to look at when we're also examining acculturation and assimilation. Thirdly, we have to remember that historical hostilities exist. And these hostilities can greatly influence the consumer's responsiveness to services, their interpretation of who you are and what you do, and if this is going to benefit them. Fourthly, we have to consider that cultural mistrust is real, and it's a logical response by African Americans. It is not personal, and we should not take it as an indictment of who we are and what we do within our profession, but we do know that cultural mistrust exists, and it exists for a reason. We need to understand why it exists and how to work through that. Fifth, we need to conduct some type of cultural assessment. This will help to better understand African Americans, the African American consumer's beliefs as well as practices, what this person was willing to do and not willing to do, and more importantly, why this person is willing or not willing to do that. And lastly, we need to remember that it may take a longer period of time to establish trust when working with African American consumers. And we deal with a timeline. We deal with a timeline in terms of eligibility and moving people through a process. But what we may have to start looking at is, how do we adjust that timeline? Because it's not so much that a client or consumer is uncooperative or unmotivated, but until the trust, until the rapport is there, and that can go forward and come back, can go forward and come back, and until we get to the point where the consumer trusts us to the point that we're ready to move forward, it's going to interfere with this whole timeline and time frame that we tend to work in. And so that's something else we're going to have to consider. So these are just some important points to remember. This is sort of an overview in a nutshell of issues related to African Americans and in general, and then when we add African Americans with disabilities. In closing, I think my final word would be that it's very important that we use self-education as a continuous baseline to figure out how best to serve the consumer. And at times we may have to rely on the consumer to help educate us, but that should not be an over-reliance or our primary source. It is our responsibility as service providers to understand not only the service we're providing, but the context in which we're providing it to people in relationship to how they deal with it. So that's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully we will have a meeting again at some point. Have a good one.